Okay, today is the 5th day.
In the heart of Australia, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline, an ancient landscape stretches across red deserts, narrow gorges, and rugged mountain ranges. Cutting through it all is the Larapinta Trail. 223 kilometers long, it is often described as one of Australia's greatest walks. A description that sounds inspiring right up until you actually have to walk it. During the day, temperatures can climb above 30 degrees Celsius. At night, they can drop close to freezing. Water is limited. Phone reception is mostly a distant memory. And for days at a time, your closest companions are likely to be flies, rocks, and poor decision-making. On the 21st of May, 2026, 3 hikers arrived at the western end of the trail. Mary, Tang, and Leon. None of them had ever completed a wilderness trek like this before. They had plans. They had gear. They had spreadsheets. Most importantly, they had confidence. Quite a lot of confidence, actually. The plan seemed simple. Carry everything they needed on their backs, walk across the Australian outback, reach the finish line 12 days later. What they didn't know was that over the next 12 days, they would battle freezing nights, relentless heat, swollen feet, endless rocks, questionable navigation, rapidly disappearing food supplies, and a level of suffering that would eventually become funny. But on day 1, standing at the trailhead with fresh legs and heavy backpacks, they still believed they were prepared. The desert, meanwhile, remained unconvinced. Before heading into the wilderness, the team spent one final day in Alice Springs. This would be their last encounter with many luxuries that modern civilization has to offer. Hot showers, reliable electricity, unlimited water, and perhaps most importantly, supermarkets. The day was spent doing what all inexperienced backpackers do before a major expedition: buying things, then buying more things, then discovering they had forgotten something, and buying even more things. There were detailed gear checks, lengthy discussions about weight, careful calculations about food, and surprisingly passionate debates about items nobody would remember a week later. At one point, they went looking for a camping hammer. The local store offered several options. The internet offered a different solution: just use a rock. As it turned out, this advice was remarkably effective. As the day went on, backpacks became heavier, confidence remained high. Neither of these trends would continue for very long. By evening, everything was finally packed. Food supplies were sorted, batteries were charged, cameras were ready, the plan was in place. Tomorrow, they would leave roads, shops, and mobile reception behind. Ahead lay 223 kilometers of desert. Behind them stood the last comfortable bed they would see for nearly 2 weeks. At the time, nobody seemed particularly concerned about that. They probably should have been. The following morning, reality began making its presence known. A local shuttle driver named Alex picked the team up and headed west toward the start of the trail.
Job was cleaning in a school, and I made more money.
Along the way, food resupply boxes were dropped at remote campsites scattered across the desert. Those boxes would become extremely important later. At the time, however, nobody was thinking much about food. The first concern was Tang's headache. A familiar problem had chosen a particularly inconvenient moment to return. After some painkillers and a brief discussion about whether this was a terrible idea, the group decided to continue. Turning back before the hike had even started felt slightly embarrassing. As the drive continued, they met other hikers preparing for the same journey. One group had started with 12 people, but only 6 were still going. Another hiker was waiting to be evacuated due to illness. For the first time, the Larapinta Trail stopped feeling like a travel plan and started feeling like a genuine challenge. The warning signs were there. The team simply chose not to pay much attention to them. After all, they were runners. Marathons had been completed, trail races had been completed, countless training sessions had been completed. How difficult could a long walk possibly be? Whenever they looked at the official hiking times, they quietly assumed those estimates were written for normal people. This assumption would age badly. By late afternoon, they arrived at Redbank Gorge, the western end of the Larapinta Trail, and their home for the first night. Camp was quickly set up. Earlier in Alice Springs, an unreasonable amount of time had been spent debating whether to buy a tent hammer. Standing in a campground covered entirely in rocks, the answer now seemed obvious. The Australian outback had generously provided thousands of free replacements. As the temperature climbed, the tents became increasingly difficult to enjoy. Seeking shade and cooler air, Mary and Leon wandered deeper into the gorge. There, hidden between towering red cliffs, was a permanent waterhole, crystal clear water, red sandstone walls, and brilliant desert sunlight. For a brief moment, everything looked exactly like the postcard. Then the flies arrived. Not a few flies. Thousands of flies. They landed on faces, cameras, backpacks, food, and any exposed piece of skin they could find. The locals barely seemed to notice them. The visitors, however, would spend the next 12 days developing a much more personal relationship. Looking back, months had been spent preparing for this adventure. Gear had been researched, spreadsheets had been created, equipment had been weighed. But eventually, every expedition reaches the same point. The planning ends, the talking stops, and all that's left is to start walking.
This is our second day. We wake up at 3 a.m. this morning. Today, we will go to section 12. We will go for Mount Sonder to see the sunrise.
Day 2 began at 2:30 inches the morning. Not because anyone was feeling particularly energetic, but because the team had decided that watching sunrise from the summit of Mount Sonder was somehow a good idea. Mount Sonder is one of the most famous landmarks on the Larapinta Trail. Rising alone above the desert, it can be seen from kilometers away. It looks magnificent in photographs. Reaching the top before dawn is a different matter. The night had been far less enjoyable than expected. One team member had gone to bed shortly after sunset, only to spend the rest of the night waking up repeatedly. First because it was cold, then because it was even colder. More clothing was added, sleeping positions were adjusted. Several attempts were made to ignore the increasingly obvious need to visit the toilet. None were successful. By the time the alarm sounded, everyone was technically awake, although nobody could honestly claim to be well rested. The climb began in darkness. Headlamps illuminated a narrow strip of trail ahead while everything else disappeared into the blackness. Tang was still recovering from the previous day's headache. Mary was returning to hiking after knee rehabilitation. Leon had very little experience hiking through the dark. Altogether, it was an inspiring combination. Other hikers moved past with surprising speed. Several of them appeared to be comfortably enjoying retirement. At some point, the team's strategy shifted from trying to lead the climb to simply keeping the retirees within sight. Remarkably, it worked. Just before sunrise, they reached the summit. Then the desert began to wake up. Shadows stretched across the valleys. The red landscape slowly turned gold. Mountain ridges emerged from the darkness one by one. For a few minutes, nobody talked. Not because they were overwhelmed by emotion, although that may have been part of it, mostly because everyone was too tired. Still, the view was extraordinary. Some places are difficult to explain with photographs or video. They only make sense when you stand there yourself. Mount Sonder at sunrise is one of those places. The walk back felt completely different. During the climb, the world had existed only within the beam of a headlamp. Now the entire desert stretched out in every direction. This was the first mountain of the journey, and carrying only light day packs, the team still felt strong, capable, and perhaps a little overconfident. Back at camp, Tang's condition improved dramatically. His ability to start conversations with complete strangers immediately returned, which everyone took as a positive sign. Stories were exchanged, confidence grew, and the mood improved. The hardest part, they believed, was finally behind them. It wasn't. In fact, the real Larapinta Trail had not even started yet. Tomorrow, the backpacks would be loaded properly. From that point on, everything would have to be carried across the desert. Food, water, cameras, batteries, camping gear. Every unnecessary item would become increasingly difficult to justify. The next 12 days would answer a simple question. Were they actually prepared for any of this? Day 3 marked the beginning of the real journey. The sightseeing phase was over. From this point forward, everything had to be carried. Food, water, tents, sleeping gear, cameras, batteries, solar panels, and several items that had seemed absolutely essential while standing in a comfortable hotel room. The route covered 26 kilometers, rated grade 4 with an official hiking time of 9.5 hours. Looking at those numbers, the team remained cautiously optimistic. This was their final mistake before breakfast. Cloud cover kept temperatures down, which was excellent news for hiking, but terrible news for the collection of electronics hanging off nearly every backpack. Solar panels produced very little power, and batteries suddenly felt more valuable than food. The backpacks themselves quickly became the main story. Tang's weighed around 20 kilograms, Leon's weighed around 20 kilograms, Mary's was slightly lighter. At the time, nobody seemed particularly concerned. After all, they were runners. How bad could it be? Within the first hour, everyone found out. The packs rubbed, shifted, squeezed, and refused to sit comfortably. Every few hundred meters, somebody stopped to adjust straps, hip belts, or load lifters. Later, they learned that many experienced long-distance hikers carry around 10% of their body weight. The team was carrying closer to 30%. Suddenly, a great many things made sense. At the first water stop, removing a backpack produced an almost spiritual level of happiness. Then came the climb to Hilltop Lookout. The trail went up, continued going up, and then somehow found more ways to go up. Drone filming became increasingly important throughout the day. Officially, it was about capturing the landscape. Unofficially, it provided an excellent excuse to sit down and recover. Looking back across the Red Desert, the view was spectacular. Looking at how far they still had to walk was considerably less inspiring. As the day continued, trees became less common, shade became less common, and mobile reception disappeared entirely. All that remained was the trail, long, red, and seemingly endless. By late afternoon, the campsite always appeared to be just around the next corner. It never was. The final kilometers introduced river crossings, mud, and a steady stream of new obstacles. After nearly 10 hours of walking, the team finally reached Finke River Camp. Unfortunately, arriving at camp did not mean resting. Tents still needed to be pitched, water collected, dinner cooked, batteries managed, and equipment organized. The work simply changed shape. By the end of the evening, confidence had become noticeably quieter. Lying in their tents, the team began asking questions that had not existed 3 days earlier. Were the backpacks too heavy? Had they packed too much? Were they approaching this the wrong way? Nobody knew the answer yet, but tomorrow, they would continue searching for it. Day 4 felt strangely generous. After the previous day's 26 kilometers of suffering, the route ahead covered only 8.9 kilometers with an official hiking time of 4 hours. For the first time since arriving in the desert, the team looked at the schedule and thought, that seems reasonable. Naturally, nobody trusted it. The morning began much like the previous ones. Everyone woke up cold, everyone woke up dirty, and everyone was becoming increasingly aware that modern humans are not designed to go several days without a proper shower. Still, compared with day 3, morale had improved dramatically. The backpacks felt slightly less hostile, the legs felt slightly less broken, and nobody was openly questioning their life choices. Just after midday, the team arrived at Ormiston Gorge. What appeared on the horizon was not merely a campground, it was civilization. There were hot showers, there were power outlets, there was a cafe, there was mobile reception. After several days in the wilderness, these discoveries felt almost unreasonable. The reaction was immediate. Every available power socket was occupied within minutes. Phones, cameras, drones, batteries, power banks, anything capable of holding electricity was plugged in. If someone had discovered a way to recharge hiking boots, those probably would have been plugged in too. For a few glorious hours, life felt easy again. Hot food appeared, devices came back to life, messages were sent home, the outside world briefly returned. But comfort has a dangerous side. It makes you forget what's coming next. The following stage of the Larapinta Trail would include 3 consecutive long-distance days: 29 kilometers, 27 kilometers, and 31 kilometers. Nearly 90 kilometers through some of the most remote sections of the entire route. Looking ahead, the challenge seemed intimidating. Looking back, the team had already learned something important. The wilderness doesn't care how fit you are, how many races you finished, or how confident you felt before leaving home. Eventually, every hiker is reduced to the same simple goal. Wake up tomorrow, put on the backpack, keep moving forward. And tomorrow, the real test would begin. The next 3 days would become known simply as the Wild 3 Days. 29, 27, and 31 kilometers, 90 kilometers in total. At first, those numbers looked intimidating. A few days later, they would start feeling strangely normal. Every morning began the same way. At 4:30 a.m., the Milky Way still hung above the desert while alarms dragged 3 reluctant hikers out of freezing tents. Sleeping bags were packed, mats were rolled up, water was boiled, breakfast disappeared in silence. By 6:30, everyone was moving east through the darkness. For a while, the desert felt gentle. The air was cold, the valleys were quiet, the sunrise painted the mountains in soft colors. Even the backpacks seemed lighter than they really were. Then the sun climbed higher, and the trail remembered what it was supposed to be. Long zigzag climbs led toward ridgelines that never seemed to get any closer. Every summit revealed a spectacular view, followed immediately by another obstacle. Sharp rocks covered the ridges. Steep descents punished tired knees. Endless boulder fields filled the valleys below. Thousands upon thousands of rocks waited underfoot, each one carefully designed to be slightly worse than the last. Walking became less about fitness and more about concentration. Eyes searched for the next safe step. Brains calculated landing points. One mistake could mean a twisted ankle, a fall, or simply wasting energy that nobody could spare. If the team was lucky, the afternoon brought flatter ground. Unfortunately, flat ground usually meant full exposure to the sun. Shade disappeared, hot wind arrived, sweat-soaked clothing dried and then returned again. The flies maintained their usual level of enthusiasm. As the kilometers accumulated, conversations became shorter. Then they disappeared entirely. By the final hours of each day, nobody wanted to film. Nobody wanted to fly a drone. Sometimes nobody even wanted to take out a phone. The scenery remained spectacular. The problem was that appreciating scenery also required energy. The routine never changed. Walk until sunset, reach camp, collect water, pitch tents, cook dinner, charge equipment with whatever power remained, crawl into sleeping bags, wake up cold. Repeat? Day after day, the process became strangely automatic. The backpack stopped feeling unusual. The exhaustion stopped feeling unusual. Even living without showers, electricity, or phone reception stopped feeling unusual. The team had entered a different world, one measured not by hours or days, but by water sources, campsites, and the distance to the next food drop. 90 kilometers later, the wild 3 days finally came to an end. There was no celebration, no dramatic finish, no triumphant music. Just 3 hikers dropping their backpacks onto the ground and standing quietly for a moment. Because by then, they had learned something important. The hardest part of a long wilderness trek is rarely a mountain, a river crossing, or a difficult section of trail. The hardest part is waking up each morning knowing exactly how much the day is going to hurt, and choosing to keep walking anyway. The team had assumed that completing the wild 3 days would unlock an easier chapter of the trail. This assumption lasted approximately 1 day. Day 8 was only 14.9 kilometers long. On paper, that sounded encouraging. What the map failed to mention was that nearly every meter of those 14.9 kilometers was trying to cause trouble. The morning began with a series of water crossings inside a narrow gorge. Some sections were too deep to walk through without soaking backpacks. Others were too slippery to cross confidently. Progress quickly turned into a team sport involving passing packs, helping each other climb over rocks, and occasionally questioning whether any of this was a good idea. At one particularly awkward crossing, a young hiker appeared and casually helped lift heavy backpacks across an obstacle that had nearly defeated the entire team. It was a humbling experience. The hikers thanked her. Their backpacks thanked her. Their remaining self-respect did not. By the time everyone emerged from the gorge, a surprising amount of energy had already been spent. Unfortunately, the day was only getting started. As the trail climbed higher, the temperature climbed with it. The clouds disappeared, the shade disappeared, the flies returned to full-time employment. Tang was the first to admit that his battery was running low. Before long, everyone's battery was running low. Every uphill section seemed longer than expected. Every ridgeline revealed another ridgeline beyond it. The team continued moving forward through a combination of determination, stubbornness, and the growing realization that there was no practical alternative. At one point, Leon moved ahead to scout the route. A small green snake shot across the trail and disappeared before anyone could properly react. Then, a little later, he managed to create an entirely different problem by taking a wrong turn. The route appeared reasonable, it was not. A few minutes later, he found himself standing on a rock face with a 20-kilogram backpack, unable to continue forward and not particularly excited about going back. For a brief moment, the situation became unnecessarily educational. Eventually, gravity, caution, and common sense reached an agreement and everyone returned safely to the correct trail. Unfortunately, Larapinta still had one final challenge prepared. The last 7 kilometers followed a boulder-filled gorge. There was no smooth path, no easy walking, only rocks, large rocks, small rocks, loose rocks, sharp rocks, an astonishing variety of rocks. Hour after hour, the team jumped, balanced, climbed, and stumbled their way forward. By then, every step landed directly on increasingly unhappy feet. The campsite finally appeared shortly before dark. 11 and a half hours had passed. For a day officially measuring less than 15 kilometers, it felt remarkably effective at causing suffering. That evening, nobody talked very much, everyone was too tired, and everyone secretly suspected the trail had just won the latest round. Day 9 was supposed to be easier. After surviving the technical chaos of the previous day, 18 kilometers no longer sounded particularly frightening. The distance, however, was not the problem. The problem was a pair of feet. After hours of jumping across boulders the day before, every step now felt like walking on thumbtacks. The pain appeared immediately and showed no interest in leaving. Extra socks were added, insoles were removed, shoelaces were loosened, various adjustments were attempted. None of them felt especially convincing. At the same time, another problem had quietly emerged. The team's gas supply was running out far faster than expected. It turned out that planning fuel consumption for 3 Chinese hikers required a level of optimism that reality did not support. Reaching the next campsite before the store closed had suddenly become a priority. So the day became a race against 2 things: time and sore feet. Surprisingly, the trail itself was relatively kind. After everything Larapinta had thrown at the team over the previous days, simply walking felt almost relaxing. By midday, they reached Standley Chasm, one of the most developed campsites on the entire route. And suddenly, civilization returned. There were hot showers, power outlets, Wi-Fi, a cafe. Real food, the sort of place where exhausted hikers begin staring emotionally at fish and chips. For the first time in days, everyone stopped thinking about the trail and started thinking about recovery. Unfortunately, the feet had other plans. Once the shoes came off, the damage became obvious. Large blisters had formed beneath the forefoot. Every explanation seemed reasonable. Every solution seemed questionable. Advice arrived from friends, the internet, and even artificial intelligence. Confidence did not. For the first time during the entire trek, quitting became a serious possibility. Transport back to Alice Springs was researched. Contingency plans were discussed. The finish line suddenly felt very far away. By the evening, everyone was exhausted. The feet needed time, the bodies needed time, the minds probably needed time too. So a decision was made. The trail could wait, tomorrow would be a rest day. Because finishing one day later was still infinitely better than not finishing at all. Nobody had planned for a rest day. By the time the team reached Standley Chasm, nobody was arguing against one. The original plan had been simple: keep moving east until the trail was finished. Reality suggested a different strategy. Feet needed recovery, shoulders needed recovery, minds needed recovery. So for one day, the adventure paused. Gear was washed, batteries were charged, large amounts of food were consumed. Most importantly, several kilograms of equipment were removed from the backpacks and left behind. At first, it felt like losing something. Later, it felt like freedom. When the hike resumed, the landscape had not changed. The sun was still hot, the rocks were still everywhere, the mornings were still cold, the flies remained fully committed to their mission. Yet somehow, everything felt easier. Not because the trail had become easier, because the hikers had changed. During the first few days, every problem felt like a surprise. Every climb felt unfair. Every difficult section felt personal. Now they understood the rhythm of the desert. Start early, walk steadily. Drink before you're thirsty, rest before you're exhausted, and stop carrying things you don't actually need. The final days passed almost quietly. The team moved more efficiently, complaints became less frequent, confidence returned, although this time it felt different, less like optimism. More like experience. There were still long kilometers, still sore feet, still moments of exhaustion, but the wilderness no longer felt like an opponent. It felt familiar. On the 2nd of June 2026, after 12 days of hiking and one unexpected rest day, the team finally reached the eastern end of the Larapinta Trail. Officially, the route measured 223 kilometers. Their watches recorded considerably more. No one seemed interested in the exact number. There was no dramatic finish line, no cheering crowds, no medals. Just cold drinks, tired legs, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had finished something that had once seemed impossible. Looking back, the most valuable part of the journey was never the scenery. It was the difficult moments, the freezing nights, the heavy backpacks, the blisters, the wrong turns. The days when quitting seemed reasonable, and the decision to keep going anyway. The wilderness had provided beautiful views, but those were never the real lesson. The real lesson was much simpler. You rarely discover what you're capable of when everything is comfortable. You discover it when things stop going according to plan. And despite all the rocks, all the heat, all the flies, and all the suffering, there was one final surprise waiting at the end. Somewhere along the trail, 3 inexperienced backpackers had quietly become hikers. The desert, at last, seemed convinced.